This is Mike with M Squared Enjoying the Now. In this video I am going to show you how to modify your AC electrical system in your RV. Since we began going full-time RVing, something we've always wanted was a washer and dryer. So we didn't have to spend hours at a laundromat to do laundry. We read a lot of reviews. A lot of people are disappointed with their washer and dryer. It doesn't wash correctly, or it takes forever to dry their clothes, if at all. They have to end up hanging them out. So today I'm going to show you how to modify your system to install a 220 dryer. So this is your typical residential, not RV, but residential electrical panel and outlets. A 110 outlet and a 220 outlet. I'm going to show you how those work. So from your street, you'll have two hot lines coming in to run your service, your main breaker in your house. Your two main hot lines coming in are designated phase 1 or phase A and phase B. Those will be hooked to your main breaker. So if anything happens outside, or if you have to shut the system down, you can trip the breaker here and that'll shut phase A and phase B down. So the way a 110 outlet works, you're using a single phase and a single pole breaker, which will be right here. So it'll be on this single phase. So this whole phase is 120. This phase is 120. So it's going across a single phase with your breaker. You got your line voltage coming out to your outlet. Then you'll have your neutral going to the neutral side of the plug. And then obviously you need a ground. So the way a 220 breaker works, it takes power from phase A and phase B. So your 220 breaker, which should always be connected by a breaker tie, it's taken 120 off of phase A and it's taken 120 off of phase B, and then it will run to each phase of your 220 plug to include your neutral and your ground. The reason why there's a breaker tie is if either phase goes out, it can trip the breaker. If that breaker tie wasn't there and a phase went out, something happened with one of the phases in this line, if this got a short here or a short here, if you didn't have a breaker tie, one side would flip and you're only getting a single phase to whatever this is connected to, your dryer, your stove, and then it won't run correctly because you only have 110 coming in one side, and you can burn the motor or the element out. And that's why a breaker tie is installed across there, so if either phase burns out, both of these will trip. That'll shut the whole system down and you won't ruin your equipment. The main difference between a residential breaker box and an RV breaker box is that the RV box going horizontally, and the phases, phase A and phase B, are separated horizontally. So all they're doing is splitting this in half and rotating this phase up this way, rotating this phase up this way, like that. And your main breaker coming from your pedestal will be hooked here with a breaker tie. So and all they do, exactly the same, just horizontally, and what they'll do, two main lines coming of your power pole, phase A, phase B, that's your main breaker. So you have your phase A here, phase B. A will be running this side, B will be running this side. And what I do, since I installed solar, I no longer have a breaker bar here, because I have a main breaker in with my solar, so I don't need this breaker tie. It'll trip in the main bay instead of here. That way, when I hook up the dryer 30 amp circuit, I'm going to need a breaker tie, because I don't want to split them phases up. So I'm just going to move the main breaker over one, move the other main breaker over here, and then I'll have my 30 amp dryer breaker in the middle with a breaker tie. So if anything happens to either of these phases on the dryer, it'll trip both circuits and it won't burn out my element in my dryer or the motor. Okay, so here is your typical RV breaker box. As you can see, I was telling you earlier, they went from vertical in your residential to horizontal. And each phase is broken up, turned 90 degrees. So this will be a phase, this will be a phase. And from your pedestal, the power pedestal, we have our 50 amp circuit. So the line voltage coming in from the 50 amp will come here, come in from the back, pop up here, and then there'll be a main breaker here. The other line voltage coming in, come in from the back, come in here, and there'll be the other breaker here. And this is your main lug right here. So if something happened, it would trip the main lug, all your power goes out to this side and to this side, the left phase and the right phase. And these are hooked to your breaker, your main breaker right here. And across this breaker, as you can see here, this would be a main breaker. This is only 30 amp because this is what I'm going to be using for the dryer plug, but I'll have a 50 amp. There's a 50 amp breaker in there. And as you can see, they are hooked together. It's what's called a breaker tie. So if anything happens, they'll both trip like that and turn themselves off. If you don't have this breaker tie in there and something happens on one side or the other and only one side trips, then you'll still have power to the other phase. If this phase trips, then you'll still have power to that phase. So what I had to do, so I'm going to be hooking 240 up. So that means I need a breaker that has a breaker tie in there. Because I'm running 240, that means if one side breaks, my dryer would only be sucking 120, and that could burn the motor out. It would still run, but not the way it's supposed to be, because it needs two phases. If one comes out, it's running on one phase, which will damage the dryer. So what I'm going to have to do, since these two phases are separated, I will move my main lug, my main breaker over. So now my main power is coming here from the pedestal. Just separate the two. Move that over here. So now I have my 240, because I'm pulling in this side and this side from the main breakers. So now I have my 30 amp breaker, which I just showed you, because I need to have the breaker tie in between there. And now this is going to be for my dryer, my washer and dryer. So now these two lines, of course I forgot to tell you, to include coming off the pedestal, you'll have the neutral coming into the neutral bar, and then the ground coming in the ground bar. As I said, it's all the same as a residential, same as the RV. It's going to be working out the same way. You got to have the neutral, the ground, and the two phases. The only problem is they rotated them 90 degrees. And that's why I had to separate these two, because I needed the breaker tie in case one of the phases go out it won't ruin the dryer. So now what I'm going to do, and I guess they thought ahead, because in our laundry room there are two outlets, two 110 outlets, because they all assume that you're going to buy a 110 washer and dryer, and each one of these are hooked up a single breaker, 20 amp breaker, going to the dryer, then another breaker going for the washer, which would have been fine if we got a 110 washer and dryer, but we don't have that. We wanted something a little bit more powerful, so it doesn't take 3 days to dry clothes. So now what I'm going to have to do, since these lines are running here, I am going to take a 220 box, eliminate these two, take these wires for my dryer cord, take the hot lead off of this line, take the hot lead for this line. This is my load, these are my line voltage, and of course there's always going to be a ground there. Take the ground, hook those to the ground, and then the ones coming off the neutral bar, I'll take, because there'll be neutral over here, take the neutral, and those will be tied together down here for the neutral. So that means I'm eliminating these two because they're on a phase, they're on a single phase. Now some people say, why don't you take one of these and put it on the other phase? Well, you can't do that, because if I eliminated one of the breakers, moved it over here, which is in your head it seems kind of right, because this is one phase, this is two phase, because this has to be two phase, but I need to have these breakers tied together. It's virtually impossible, unless you MacGyver it, to tie this one into this one, because if one side trips, they both need to trip. Now there is a custom box you can buy, it's called a combiner box, where you can plug these two in, and the box has a sensor in it, so if it senses one of the 120 legs going out, it'll trip both breakers. This is much easier this way and a lot less expensive, because they're like $200, $300 for those combiner boxes. So all I did is eliminate those breakers, move them to the center, because I still have main power coming in this phase and this phase. That way I can hook it up with the breaker tie. Simple. If you have any questions, let me know. I know it's kind of a weird drawing, but once you get the concept of the phases, it's pretty simple. Like I said, there's residential. You have the two hot lines coming in off the pole with your main breaker right here. This is a phase, this is a phase. 120 circuit goes on a single phase. If you have a 220 component, then it has to go across two phases, and there'll be two lines coming out. 110 has one. Easy peasy. Okay, so here is our soon-to-be laundry room. Like I was explaining earlier, I have two outlets, one for the dryer, one for the washer. Now if you had a typical washer and dryer you install in here for an RV, it's always going to be 110. The 110 dryer, either vented or not, takes a long time to dry because it's only 110. So what I'm going to do, since this is on a single breaker, this is on a separate breaker, I'm going to be combining those two with that 30 amp breaker that I showed you earlier. That way I have two phases to run the motor properly, run the dryer properly. And I know that all my lines are coming in from the ceiling down to here. And what I'm going to do is install my dryer plug. Yeah, removed the two outlets, disconnected them, got my hole cut. Little obstacle here. It's not a biggie. When I put the box in, I'll have a stud there on either side to attach it to. It'll stick out a little bit, but it'll be above the washer and dryer. Also reinstalled the two plugs. They are not connected to any circuit. I'm just going to leave them there in case anybody wants to convert it back. If we happen to sell this, and they can just disconnect the two wires from there, run them back to the outlets if they're going to have a 110 washer and dryer, and then just change out the breakers. Okay, here is my actual breaker box for the RV. And I know I mentioned to you earlier about having breaker tie in there. Here are my, get this, here's my main breaker. As you can see, there's no breaker tie in between there, like this one. The reason why there isn't, and I took it out, is because I installed solar. On the solar, it only runs off of 30 amps, so when I'm plugged into 50 amp, I had to split the legs. So I've got one of the hot legs coming in here. This will be coming off the pedestal. The other leg is separated, goes through my multi-plus, and then comes back here. So I had to separate this, so if anything happens, I'll still have a leg hot on this side or a leg hot on this side. And these are just off because they're not hooked to anything. So what I'm going to do, since these are my two main hot wires coming in, it's going to work the same. All I'm going to do is move it over, and then move this one over. That way I can install this 30 amp breaker right in the center, because I need that breaker bar in between there. And then these will run, I'm not sure which one, I'll have to look. I did mark everything at one point, washer and dryer, so I'll find those two circuits, remove the wire, move them to the center to my breaker that has a breaker tie. And because this is a single phase, this is a phase, these two are not hooked together. That way, when I put my breaker in here for the dryer, I'll have phase 1 and phase 2 over here. If you don't have two different phases on a 240 or 220, it's not going to run right. You need both phases or you'll burn your motor up in your dryer. Real easy to do. I know it sounds kind of complicated, but as long as you understand the two legs, the two phases, and run it a 240, it's pretty easy. Of course, down here we have the neutral bar, and right behind it is the grounding bar. All those wires are hooked up, so it's not a problem. All I'm doing is changing a couple breakers, moving my mains over, and we'll be good to go. Okay, so you can see here I have my breaker box all disassembled, all the wires disconnected, and I have my main breaker coming from the pedestal. This other breaker is coming from the inverter converter multi-plus, and then all my lines. As you can see, this side will be the main for the pedestal. This side will be the main that's coming from the multi-plus. So even though I wouldn't be connected to a pedestal, these breakers still be active but running off the battery. So I have to make sure what I'm hooking up here won't drain the batteries too fast. So these will be a few selected plugs, and then I'll have the two mains on the second one. And here in the middle, like I explained before, I'm going to have to put a breaker in there with a breaker tie. That'll be the washer and the dryer will be right in the middle. Right in the middle. Either side of those will be the mains. Then I'll have two sets of double pole breakers here and two double pole breakers there. And I did mark all the lines so I knew what was going where, to which plugs, to what washer, dryer, the coffee maker plug, refrigerator, GFCIs, and everything that goes outside. Okay, there we go. Got all the breakers reinstalled. Like I said, this is my washer and dryer. Has to be on a breaker tie. In case one of the legs goes out, they'll both go out. That way you won't ruin your heating element in the dryer and the motor. Got my two mains. This one's coming from the inverter converter, multiplus. This one's coming from the pedestal. So that's running this right now, and that's running this side. Power also goes through the multiplus, which will also help, batteries will help this if I'm low on power. This one's not being used. And there we go. Washer and dryer's all installed. Fits in there nicely. Didn't have to secure it. It doesn't go anywhere when we're traveling. And plug.